He's going to talk to us today about a grounded theory investigation into the process of men encountering their gender in counselor education. So I'm going to turn it over to Brian.
Thanks. Yeah, I kind of joke with people. My research areas are me, pretty much. Within counseling tends to be white folk and men, so far. So we'll see if that changes. But I find that my curiosities draw me in those areas, and that's what keeps my research fueled. So that's what I stay with so far. It's been fun. So yeah, today we'll talk about this study. This study was done with a group, my cohort for MDoc program, so there were 6 of us as researchers plus our advisor. My hope for today is to spend around half the time walking through the study, so looking at methodology and looking at results, and then around the other half the time having discussion. So the structure I'm hoping for is to hold questions until the PowerPoint is through. I use PowerPoints more for me than for you, but there should be some valuable visuals up there too. It helps me to be structured. I prefer the conversation part. My profession leading into being in higher ed is counselor, so I talk to people for a living, and then my research is qualitative, so I talk to people in my research, and then I really enjoy teaching and supervising within counseling, so I talk. So I like to talk, so I like the conversations. And that's also what kind of drew my curiosity to do this study, and so that's the part I'm looking forward to the most for today. My hope is the PowerPoint will give you some ideas that will fuel the discussion. I know there's some interest in the methodology and there's some interest in the results, so from my understanding of the group, we have enough varied interest that I imagine we can have some rich dialogue around it. Let's see if this is gonna, there we go, that'll work better. Like I said, this is a research team that I was on. There were 6 of us who were researchers and then our advisor. So I was a primary investigator for this study. This was an interest I had because I was curious if men in counseling were having any experiences that were similar to the experiences I was having. And we were constructing a study and brainstorming ideas, and I said, I have this curiosity. I'm wondering if other people are having this curiosity, and it matched with the overall goals for the research team, so we decided to pursue it. So the first 6 people on there, that's my doc cohort, and then the last person on there, David, is my advisor, as well as advised us on this study. He teaches our qualitative methodology courses and is a respected qualitative researcher within the counselor education profession, and has given quite a bit of help to us. And actually, we're in the final stages of editing the manuscript to submit, with the goal of submitting by the end of the semester so it can be in the review process by summer. And David has now come on as the final author on the study and is helping us in the final revisions. Also helped us so much in the process of the research itself that in our opinion, it was only right that he already be on it. And I think it's been even more helpful to have his input in the final edits. So that's been really good. So we are quite literally in that process. We were chatting about it a bit via email today. So a little overview, 6 researchers, myself included, 12 participants. Within the counseling profession, there's an accrediting body called CACREP. I think it stands for the council. It's council, it doesn't actually matter, but it's the only accrediting body for counseling, roughly. There's some other smaller, but this is the big overarching. So the program here is a CACREP accredited program. All the programs I've ever been a part of are CACREP accredited. We decided to focus on CACREP accredited programs for our sample with our participants because it also fit with the consistency of the training. Because all of our participants were enrolled at the time of the data collection, at the time of the interviews, were enrolled in accredited counseling programs. By sticking with accredited programs, we had a much more awareness of what their structure would be and the consistency of that across. If you go outside of accredited, valuable training nonetheless, and they have a bit of their own flows that we weren't quite sure of. We used constructivist grounded theory as the methodology. That's a qualitative methodology. It's a specific philosophical orientation within grounded theory, which looks at which is used to look at process, to investigate process, and I'll chat a little bit more about that. And then our research question is, what is the gender identity development process of male counselors in training as they progress through an accredited counseling training program? So we were especially curious about how is the process of being in the training then interacting with gender, so then influencing that process of gender development. Luckily, it was. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had a study anymore, I don't think. But that wasn't an issue because it ended up being great. And we ended up going with 12 participants because we had 6 researchers. In terms of a grounded theory study, that would be quite cumbersome for one researcher to do. So we had 2 participants per researcher because you're conducting the interviews, and I'll get into some more of that. But if I were to try to do a study with 12 participants in the same way we did this study, it would not help if I was trying to produce research very consistently. It would be quite tough. I know people do it, and when they do it, I'm very impressed. The reasoning as well that we focused here is, according to the KCREP as of 2016, and KCREP collects demographic information from all programs. So as a whole, in the counseling profession within counselor education programs, less than 20% of the students identified as male. So we're looking at over 80% identifying as female. So and then less than 1% identifying as another gender is what KCREP identifies as an alternative gender. I think there's a lot of different wording that could be used there, but KCREP divided it out in 3 categories. So I knew, as somebody who had gone through counseling training programs as a male, that there weren't many of us in the programs I had been through. And then when we looked at the statistics, we realized very quickly that that was across the board and across the nation. KCREP, to my knowledge, only accredits within the United States, so this would also be only within the US. Also, I knew, as somebody who had been going through the counseling training process, that the professional values within counseling tend to be values that might conflict with masculine norms. And so there's the values of exploration and exploring emotion and vulnerability and authenticity and things that within the US, when it comes to masculinity, can be at odds with how I myself as a man had been taught to be a man, taught to not show emotion, taught to not show vulnerability, taught that authenticity only when it aligns with masculinity. So I knew that I went into this profession having an experience that was counter to how I had been taught within society to be. And I was curious, because I knew it had influenced my gender, my masculinity especially, and how I related to it in my process. So I was curious if others were too. Now, an interesting part of our research team is I was the only man on the team. So that became something that I think really helped us, because we were able to talk about that during the process of the research study. So of the 6, I identify as a man, and all the other 5 identify as women. So a little bit about grounded theory. We were using constructivist grounded theory specifically. And that was developed by Kathy Sharmaz. Now, that's who's kind of credited with it and has the book for it and all of that. Other people talk about constructivist methodologies. Other people talk about constructivist grounded theory. Kathy Sharmaz is usually the person that's looked at as the person that originated it. Now you can find debates in the old literature, as you can with most things, but that's what we went with. There's a lot. Sharmaz has written a lot about grounded theory, so there's a lot of stuff to find. We referenced Constructing Grounded Theory was the title of the book the most, and this I think this is the most recent edition, the 2nd edition. And so the thing about constructivist grounded theory looks at views learning, we'll say learning generally, as embedded within social contexts. So it's a social construction. This fit also with our looking at masculinity, because from our perspective, and I think generally there's an agreement that masculinity is rooted within a social context and that it's socially influenced, so it also matched what we're attempting to observe. Grounded theory as a whole, like any grounded theory, is also looking at process. So within qualitative methodology, there's multiple places to focus. Grounded theory is looking at process, which is really, generally speaking, events that are linked over a period of time. So an example that I think would be probably one that all of us can relate to some extent, is, let's say, the process of learning how to count. If we were to think back to when we were first, if we can remember, we may have to ask caregivers about this phase in our life. But if we think back to when we first started to learn how to count, there's probably events when we first tried to count, when we first got to 3, when we first got to that we could link over time. Over time would be the process of learning how to count. Phenomenology looks at the event specifically, where you might look at the phenomenon, that one event, and try to go into the depth of the experience within that moment. The grounded theory is looking at the process of those experiences connected over time. So when we look at the process of encountering masculinity, we found ourselves talking with the participants about events where they were aware of encountering, or as they reflected on their past, became aware of encountering masculinity. In the initial phases, we talked about those events. Then we looked at how those events connected over time to influence their overall process of that masculinity encountering. So a little bit about the research process. So qualitative methodology, different than quantitative methodology, and how you're going to find the people who are going to participate in the study, and what you do ahead of time. So with qualitative methodology, we had, in grounded theory specifically, with our study, we had to be kind of intentional about how we recruited folks, because we're going to be sitting with them and interviewing rather than having them fill out some sort of instrument that we've developed or whatever else that the methodology might be. I'll use the simple comparisons there. Obviously, there's much more range of potential methodologies. So we engaged in purposeful sampling and maximum variation sampling. So the purposeful sampling was making sure that we were sampling from people who fit our population, males who are in an accredited program. Now, when I say male, it's a self-identification. So these are folks who self-identify as male. And then maximum variation is within that purposeful sample, we want to get as much variation as possible. So while we had to have people who identified as male and were in accredited counseling programs, we were also looking for variation across anything else when it came to the, like multiculturalism, we'll say. So we were hoping for multiple race and ethnicity, multiple identities within culture, within maybe their who they might choose to marry, who they might choose to date, so there's a lot we were hoping for. Languages they speak, areas they live within the United States. So the purposeful sampling being they needed to fit our criteria, and then maximum variation within. Now when it actually came down to it, we ended up with not quite as much variation as we wanted to. Because the way we contacted participants was we sent out emails across listservs and also targeted specific program chairs. We ended up with, I want to say, 30 or 40 volunteers, which was a lot for what we were doing, especially with our sample being so specific. And then, even still though, I don't have this statistic up there, but the counseling profession is also very white. So this doesn't quite represent how the statistics of the counseling profession, although it's not super far off to have this many people who identify as Caucasian. So you see we have 12 participants identify as male, all were assigned male at birth, 1 identifying as Asian American, the other 11 identifying as Caucasian. We had a good range of age, 24 to 49, and then 2 identifying as gay, 1 identifying as bisexual, and then 9 identifying as heterosexual, and then a variety of time spent within their counselor education program. Typically, counselor education programs range between 2 years, 2 to 3 if people are full-time, and then can go up to somewhere around 6 when people are going part-time. And so the folks in our study had, some of them were at the very beginning, first semester, and some of them were approaching graduation at the time that we did our data collection. Our data collection occurred over a period of about 9 months from when we started putting out calls for participants to when we concluded with participants. That doesn't include the writing of the manuscript and all of all of those sorts of things. But so when people started, no one had graduated, I don't think, by the time we were finishing up with them, or maybe they were like in graduation, but all of them were still active in their programs at the time, if I recall correctly. So when it comes to the data collection in terms of the interviews. So initially we constructed an interview guide. So this is something that's recommended for people who are newer within, well, I'll say Sharmaz recommends for people who are newer in their grounded theory research processes as researchers to construct a fairly moderately extensive. I don't really know what you would actually consider it. I'll tell you what ours was. Our research guide had a few guiding questions for the overall initial part of the interviews, and then we had probably another 5 or 6 questions as potential questions to ask depending on the flow of the interview. So we had what I would consider for this type of research a fairly structured interview guide. We didn't follow it verbatim, but it was there in case it was needed. We did all start with the same question, and we did all, I'm pretty sure, all asked the first few questions that were on there. From there, the conversations tended to flow wherever it ended. It tended to flow uniquely for each participant, and at that point, we would engage in the interview based off what the participants were talking about. We had a secure internet conferencing video platform. I think it ended up being very Zoom-like. I think everybody on this campus is pretty familiar with Zoom. I think also some people requested Skype. When we started the first round, we tried to use one that was super, super secure, HIPAA compliant. We're trying to go for the max, and participants gave us feedback of, this is a lot of work on their end to get that platform, and they preferred something else. So we did an amendment to the IRB and expanded to let the participants choose. I think Zoom is actually probably the easiest if you were trying to do this. This allowed us to interact with people across the United States, which was really helpful because of, especially with it being an interview. And then we recorded them. We took those recordings, we pulled out the audio only, and then we hired a professional transcriptionist to transcribe the interviews. They signed a confidentiality agreement. All of that was kind of required. We put all that together when we put the IRB together to ensure confidentiality. And then whenever we did the transcriptions, we went in, took out their names, put in their pseudonyms that they were chosen by the participants. So there was confidentiality from there out. You'll see some quotes later on. The names on those quotes are the pseudonyms that were chosen. They chose a variety. Some of them very simple, and some of them have like personal meanings to them. So some of them were kind of funny. Which was interesting. That wasn't part of the research, but it was interesting to see what they chose. There's a variety of, and then 2 rounds of interviews. 2 rounds of interviews meaning within a round there's the main interview, and then there was a follow-up interview to collaborate with them to confirm where we were headed with the categories that were emerging and our coding fit for them. So that's part of that constructivist philosophy as well. So there's a lot of participant involvement. We want to ensure that the participant's voice are what's being highlighted rather than our voices. Within research philosophy, there's a variety of options that might fit better depending on what your philosophy is. And also the restrictions of the research. We had the luxury of, I don't know if we had time when we were doc students, but we chose to do it in a way that really emphasized participant voice that also is more intensive. So if you have more demands on your research, you may make choices that are different for a variety of reasons, and that would be totally up to you. Like I said, then 2 rounds of that. So we did a first interview with them, follow-up. That then helped us construct our second round focus that was based off of that first round. Same structure again, interview, follow-up. Then we put together the final grounded theory and had a final member check with them to confirm that this fit for their experience and their process. And then I would say, I think minimum around an hour for that main interview of each round, and up to about 90 minutes, it's about an hour and a half per participant. So that's where I say if I were to be doing a study with 12 participants on my own, we start to calculate that up. It gets really time intensive if there's not a research team that's doing that. Again though, I've met people who have done it. I'm very impressed. I don't know where they find that time. And then we have a variety of coding practices. So word by word, line by line, incident with incident. And essentially that is kind of what it sounds. In the beginning, it was looking at specific words and then expanding out in specific lines. And then the incident part, I would say that was more, we started to have categories emerge. So within grounded theory, it's categories. I'm not real good with vocabulary words, so you may actually, if you know anything about grounded theory, hear me switch some stuff around that's not supposed to be there. Because it's like within phenomenology, they have slightly different certain words. I don't think it matters that much, but that's categories is the technical one. I do remember that one. So that would be where we work, like coding the codes. So that we had these categories emerge, and then we looked at those, and some of them started to be seen amongst a lot of participants, and then we might see where some of these are somewhat related, so we would combine those together. And then the interpreting dialogue. So this was something that was somewhat unique. So Jane Coe-Smith was, at the time, was a faculty at Idaho State, where I was at this time. And for her dissertation, she did a constructivist grounded theory study. And as a part of that process, kind of did 2 dissertations, really, in one. I know some of you may have done that and probably know people who have, or you look at it at the end, you're like, that's almost 400 pages. And it's because she also developed something called interpreting dialogues, which is a constructivist philosophical stance to within, I don't even know what's the proper wording for that. Within constructivists, influenced by that philosophy, she developed a member-checking, sort of, but different from her description of it, process. This was that second part of each round. So we did the main interview, which would be an hour to an hour and a half. And then they really only ended up being 10, 15 minutes, at the most 30, where we would have a conversation with them, which was the interpreting dialogue, which is a collaborative interpreting session where we're still having a conversation to explain to them the categories that were emerging, and then we wanted their feedback on that together to collaborate on the categories as they emerged. Where they kind of reviewed and they provided input, and then if needed, you could then code the interpreting dialogues. We didn't need to. Most of our interpreting dialogues consisted of, yeah, that fits exactly. Oh, okay, we'll talk to you later. Usually, with a little bit more, but essentially that. Sometimes some feedback, with the theme being that the feedback was about how it fit. One of the things we really liked about this is because we value the participant voice, we wanted to make sure the participant's voice were what really were there. That helped us also for our trustworthiness, to ensure that we weren't putting, especially for myself, but then we realized in the interactions that for all of us, we all had some assumptions about what the gender process might be, and all have our own levels of interaction with masculinity in our different roles in society. So it was really important to have that. And then we also did individual and group coding. So we would do our coding process prior, and then we would meet together, usually on a Saturday, for a while, and work through all of it together. I found that really helpful, again, to help with the trustworthiness, to ensure that we weren't imposing what we thought onto what was emerging from the transcripts. So a little more on trustworthiness. So then we focused on having prolonged engagement, triangulation, and then infusing reflexivity on our part. So having a reflective practice as part of the entire process. So the prolonged engagement really is kind of what it sounds like. How much are you engaged with the study, the research? So that came in the form of interactions with participants, and then a systematic structure of the data analysis. So us structuring the way we walked through across all 12 participants. And then interaction with the participants being those interview times. And then also interaction with the transcripts as well as we walked through. Some researchers who write about this would say you should also clock that time. And when you're writing up your manuscript, put the actual amount of time that was spent. That's, again, when helpful with trustworthiness. It could throw up some red flags if you're reading through. And probably if it's peer-reviewed from folks who know qualitative, it wouldn't have gotten all the way to the journal. But if you're reading through something and somebody mentions they spent an average of 20 minutes per participant, you would kind of go, oh, hold on. If any qualitative research I've done, that was not very much. And from what I would guess. And so it would just kind of indicate some need to follow up in those areas. And then triangulation. Just being multiple sources of interaction with the material in addition to the interviews. And so that came in the form of the current literature that we had, the meeting together within our research team, then the data from the actual interviews, the looking at participant experiences that connected over time, meeting with our advisor, the interpreting dialogues that I discussed before, and then that final member check where we presented our final, this is what it's going to be. We made sure it matched. And then reflexivity came in the form of memo writing, which would be kind of like personal journaling through the process, noticing things and writing that down to then be able to reference it. And reflexive group conversations. Those were the times, usually those came in when we met to look at the transcripts and the codes, those categories that were emerging in that coding process. And also later on when we were attempting to the initial parts of constructing the grounded theory. We did quite a bit of discussions. This all fit really well with our professional identity of counselors. All 6 of us that were on the research team, as well as our advisor, all counselors. all of us are in counselor education. If we were to go back to that research slide, you'd see at the different universities people ended up at. Everyone stayed in counselor education in their varied forms. So it fit really well for us to also talk about the process while engaged in the process and observing us observe the like that kind of layered thing, that fit. I find that the qualitative research and grounded theory, especially for me, fits because of that emphasis on process. So that was the research. Now here's what came of it. Here was my dilemma when putting together all of this stuff. We have 1 hour. We had 12 participants. And I really value, as does everyone else on the research team, participant voices. Oh man, an hour. Okay, how are you going to do that? So there's not going to be as many quotes as I would like to have in here. And that's just because we need to be able to do this in the allotted amount of time. I will say though, really what I'm kind of emphasizing in this presentation anyways is more of the process of the researchers in relation to the research study. So I include some quotes. And as I thought through it, I thought, well, really what we're talking about is that bigger process, not quite as much the participants only. But here was the image that we developed. This is the image that is currently in what will be the manuscript. This could change a bit. But what you'll see here is, so we have kind of this larger area being a bit of a linear indication. So the start of the program, finish of the program. We were looking at program specific. But then there's these influences that may be within the program or may not. And so the two overarching categories that emerged was an internal process and then external facilitators. So internal being the counselor in training participant, and then external being a variety of things that are influencing and facilitating the counselor in training participant. So within internal process, and I'll go into some details in the next slides, I'm stepping in and out of character, recognizing male privilege, finding voice to advocate for self and others. And then in the external, societal norms, minority in numbers, faculty/mentor relationships, classroom experiences and assignments, and relationship with peers. We conceptualized it as, and then it was confirmed by participants, as these internal and external aspects kind of being a bit of a circular relationship. So this isn't just like this thing goes in, next step, this thing goes in. So this isn't to be viewed as a steps. This is to be viewed more as an ongoing process in which some of these may be revisited, some of these are influencing other aspects of them. The internal, external, often it was seen that they were influencing each other quite a bit. I mean, in my experience in life, that would make sense, that the external influences the internal and vice versa. We also noticed that there was a reflecting in action and a reflecting on action. So the reflecting in action being I'm in this experience and I'm aware right now of my reflections of what's happening. And then on action being the experience has happened in the past, now I'm thinking back to that experience. We noticed those influencing the entire process. So there was a reflecting that was occurring where that cycle was maybe somebody reflecting on their stepping in and out of character, which then goes into a recognition of male privilege, that then influences that again. And so there can be an exchange that this reflection was contributing towards. And then all of them kind of searching for congruence, which we conceptualize kind of as the path to congruence. So congruence being that my internal perception of self matches my external presentation of self. So the way in which I interact with my external surroundings, people, environment, whatever, matches with how I view myself to be. So you could even say that's like a values and actions aligning. And so we'll go, and then again, we looked at within the program, but not all of these would be only existing within the program. So something like classroom experiences and assignments probably within the program, whereas societal norms, we would expect there's going to be societal norms that are influencing that aren't specific to a counselor education program. So a little more detail on that, the external factors. So social norms, within social norms, we noticed that a lot of folks were talking about family of origin, media, military, and religion. We had, I think, 2 out of the 12 had a military past of some sort. I think around half of them talked about family, around half of them talked about religion in a variety, varying amounts. And so that would be where we were coding the codes. So we started to notice these specific categories emerging, and then as we took the categories and looked at all of the categories, we noticed that these categories seem to match within a kind of a societal norms. Whereas if we wouldn't have been able to do family of origin as an entire category across, because not every single person talked about that. But across all of these that are within that, they all did. Minority in numbers was a very interesting one. There was an awareness amongst the men in counseling programs that there weren't many other men. There was almost a category that came out of that too, but it didn't quite fit. There wasn't enough of it. It kind of fits into relationships with peers, but that some of the men grouped up. And not in a like us versus you sort of way, but in a, hey, are you having the experiences like I'm having? I'm not quite, this is different. The men talked about, I'm in society and this society, like within society I have this privilege. Then I'll walk into this counseling program and having a different experience. So that's where that minority in numbers. We were very specific about the use of in numbers. They weren't saying I'm a minority, I'm having the experience that we might associate with somebody who is a non-dominant group within society. They're saying that numbers-wise, I'm aware there's less of me. Also, they talked about, though, that sometimes, by being one of the only men, that was privileged. So they weren't necessarily talking about oppression. They were talking about awareness of fewer of me than I see when I walk out of the program. Relationships with faculty and mentors. There was an awareness of gender there was a discussion of them being aware their gender was influencing those relationships. And then classroom experience assignments, that one's probably a little more straightforward. When they're in classrooms, they were aware of it. And then relationships with peers, that one was a really interesting one, especially when we looked at the male-to-male relationships within the counselor program. I think it's in the next one. So yeah, I'll hold off. There's a detail I want to add to that, but I think it connects to internal. So here's a couple quotes for a couple of those, and I'll let you all read those. So this is just within two of them. Again, to do quotes for every single one of them. The first, as I was making the PowerPoint, I did that just to see how long it would be. We didn't want to do that today. It was quite long. But we do have all of that if anyone was curious enough for a follow-up conversation. We could look at some of those. But these stood out to me as really embodying. It wasn't on purpose that they were both from Chris, the pseudonym Chris. It just was that those two stood out as nice for this presentation. But the first one, societal norms, being men are supposed to have this hard exterior. They're supposed to be reliable. I'm going to not put in the ums. We did exact transcription. We want to be able to code for that as well. That fits more. Some people will not do that, but really we would want to. I think it's better to have the ums in there. It gives it a better idea of some of that. We started to notice some staggering at certain parts of certain sorts of conversations. But I'm not going to do that as I do this. Men are supposed to have the hard exterior. They're supposed to be reliable and that they do not have weakness. They're not supposed to show their weakness. They very much try to be open and transparent. I put my weaknesses out there. I feel like society says that that's not what men are supposed to do. And then the minority in numbers, when I first met the faculty on the first couple of weeks of class, we would take roll. The teacher or professor would connect a face with a name. The teacher would always say, well, Chris, we know who you are because you're the only guy. I just felt different, but at the same time isolated. So that kind of came out too. Again, not enough to have as a category, but there was a discussion of like, I'm aware of my minority in numbers, and then there's a feeling of isolation. I don't feel like I can't quite connect with the other people in the program other than the few other men. Again, though, sometimes that actually ended up being privileged. Rather than an isolation, it was you're the only man, therefore we're going to give you access to some things that others might not because you're tokenized in some ways. Okay, so that was the external process. So now the internal process. So the categories of stepping in and out of character, recognizing male privilege, and finding voice to advocate for self and others. So stepping in and out of character, we kind of conceptualize as putting on a mask in certain settings, and we talked about that. And I think that actually was a quote from one of the participants at some point, was this idea of putting on and taking off a masculinity mask. This was really interesting when they discussed their interactions with males in their counseling program and with males outside. So they talked about this interaction where with the other men, they could kind of talk about this experiences they were having and how this process was going for them. But then when they went back out, they put back on their masculinity mask and interacted for safety for a lot of them as still that masculine man. there was a discussion of, and this matched with what it was like for me in my process as a student. So I checked in with the other researchers to kind of see if they thought, like, am I putting this onto this? And they decided, they kind of confirmed, no, it seems like this is happening. Of being like, I no longer fit with the men that are in society, that are the masculine men that embody those masculine traits, which we would guess probably nobody really feels like they fit that completely. That's kind of how those things are. But still, I no longer feel like I fit there, but I don't quite feel like I fit in the counseling profession. I'm one of the only men. This doesn't fit. So now I feel separate from any of it. So then that's where the grouping seemed to live. It was in a search for some sort of connection with somebody who I can identify with now. Because at the point they were in that process, there being that isolation. I will say, though, that resolved. So that wasn't an ongoing, like, now forever, you will never feel like you fit in any of these places. There was a resolution that occurred, too. The resolution being kind of, now a sense of agency. I can choose which aspects of masculinity I value and which aspects I want to push away, and I no longer feel the need to identify in these particular ways. And that varied across the participants, and it varied across some of their other interactions they were having in their life outside of the program. So it wasn't there enough to emerge as a category, but was there enough that it's worth noting. And then a recognition of male privilege, again, that kind of connects with I'm aware that I'm one of the only men, and at the same time I'm aware that still being privileged while also feeling isolated, while also aware of my privilege in other settings, because now being one of the only men, a minority in number, so this is where they start to interact. Minority in number has me more aware of my masculinity in a way that has me more aware of my masculinity in society, which then has me more aware of my male privilege, which then kind of connected to that finding voice to advocate for self and others. Part of that finding voice for some of them was being quiet. So we'll say that too, it wasn't it, because we, in my opinion, got to be kind of careful. We're in this area of, like, we're interacting with masculinity, we're aware of our male privilege, and now we're going to advocate for it. That's not what we're going for. And so that's not really what they were saying, really. It could be said for some of them that was, and that was a discussion we had amongst researchers, and discussed as this category was emerging, was what we really meant by advocating for the others part, because that can start to turn into oppression in itself. But it was much more of a kind of, in this increased awareness, partnering in this advocacy, which I found interesting. And here are a couple quotes from the stepping in out of character and the recognizing male privilege. So the stepping in and out of character, sometimes the safest route is to fulfill those expectations or to just fit in with how society wants to view us or how other people expect to view us. And that's usually the safest thing to be in the eyes of other people. You're not going to be questioned. And then recognizing male privilege, council education programs, really allowed me to look at it more critically than just saying I am a privileged male and not really looking at what that means beyond that point. So a facilitation of the further exploration within it. And then I will say one thing that did end up happening that I don't think I have it anywhere else, so I'll say it now while it's on my brain. We started with 12, we ended with 11 participants. So just in time dropped. It was kind of an odd thing how it happened, really. He was in the midst of traveling. And actually, I interviewed him. I was in the midst of traveling. So I think I was in England, he was in Turkey. We were attempting to connect. We kept missing each other. I got back to the States. I think he maybe replied to an email, and then he just dropped off and stopped replying to emails. Hopefully he was safe and just decided he didn't want to put the effort in. It was an odd timing because it was at the same time there was some stuff happening in Turkey while he was there. There was a bombing, so it was a weird thing. I was like, I really hope this is all okay. I think it was. So he made it through round 1, but didn't continue on to round 2. So he is represented in half of the categories that came, sort of. But it ended up being that what fit in for him fit in for everyone. So it ended up being kind of okay. But that did happen. So last couple little parts, and then we'll have some conversations. So the reflecting in and on action that we're part of it too. Here's a little more description about what that is. And so we have those internal and external processes, experiences, these things that are occurring that are kind of looping in. And part of that connection is facilitated by reflecting as it's occurring and reflecting after it's occurring. And that's from Schoen, I think is how you say his name. From the 80s, it was discussed. I think it's credited with reflecting in action and reflecting on action, but there's a lot of research around reflection that Schoen is a part of, and there's other folks too. But the reflecting in action being an active and identifiable process, identifiable is important there. And active is important. All of it's important. But those things being that, like, this is something that can be observed. Active and identifiable process in which individuals interact with their experiences and or processes as they're occurring. So you might hear that discussed now as like being present. You'll hear people use that phrasing when talking a lot about like mindfulness. That's that presence, that present moment awareness. And then reflecting on action can be compared to the learning from past experiences. So that is the thinking back on. So we conceptualized it as that also facilitated kind of the interaction with the things occurring within the programs, which then all of that fed into this path to congruence. So that would be an alignment of the preferred expression of gender with their lived expression of gender, especially as a lot of them were interacting with gender, sometimes for the first time. There was actually multiple participants discussed that by participating in the study and in the interviews, they had an increased awareness of their gender. So that facilitated their process as well. Anybody who's done qualitative research may have heard that sort of thing from participants before also. And then as that awareness increased, they gained insight into their preferred relationship with their gender identity. And so by gaining that insight into that preference, that also helped them to shift in whatever ways were necessary to get to that congruence. And then here's a quote from Mooden, who said, so that allowed me to identify some, I would say, the program allowed me to become a little more congruent in my identity. That one's just like, occasionally we would come across these quotes where we're like, oh, this is perfect. I mean, they're quite literally saying it some of the times. And that's how, obviously, that's the nice thing. I mean, the coding process isn't some sort of magical thing. I mean, sometimes it literally is being like, more congruent in my identity. Maybe a category that starts to emerge as congruence. And then eventually that ended up with path to congruence. And so then here's, again, the visualization now that we've gone through each of them. So now as you see this, there's that temporal part with the experiences that connect together to make that process. So then these internal, external, the reflection contributing to the eventual path to congruence. So the gist of it was, when our curiosity was, how is the being in a counselor education program influencing the relationship with masculinity? The answer in short was, how is this contributing a lot, and it's contributing in multiple ways, and it's resulting in more of an alignment with and more agency about how to embody masculinity as a man. So one of the things I think was interesting about it too is we didn't see any men saying like, I no longer want to be associated with masculinity. Instead, they were saying, here are the ways I would prefer to be associated, here are the ways I would prefer to try to counter, and here are the ways I'm going to now be interacting more congruently in a way to shift that masculinity. So in some ways, it could be said, we didn't say this, but it could be a follow-up study out of curiosity of, is that then contributing to any sort of what could be considered advocacy, what could be considered social justice? I mean, they are saying they're shifting within their congruence, coming to a more congruent place, which would then be countering the masculine norms that they don't want to align with anymore, which would then be change. And that's kind of, I think, we're at the goal of advocacy. Again, that would require further research. We did not go that far in this study, but that could be a follow-up study that someone could do. And then I think this last one is just, discussion. So I got kind of close to the goal of getting to a point of being able to have discussion for half the time. I think we've got 10, 15 minutes to be able to chat. And so again, at this point, so that's all the info. I can go back to slides and stuff. I prefer to sit down for these parts so we can all discuss together. And we can talk about whatever. It can be the research specifics. It can be the study itself, the stuff that emerged, other curiosities that aren't necessarily connected to anything that was on a slide. I will put the qualifier that I consider myself an emerging qualitative researcher. I do not consider myself an expert qualitative researcher. So that it could be that I say, I don't know. Here's how I might find out the answer to that question. So yeah, what are thoughts? What are people curious about?
I have just a reflection, and so looking at your results slide,
Mm-hmm.
just was wondering if you felt that process was more inductive or deductive in nature, because it looks like the way that it's visualized for us that it was a top-down process, but when I heard you talking, it sounded
Right.
more like a bottom-up process. So when you are engaging in that grounded theory,
Right.
I guess my question I'm asking you is that what influence, was it more deductive or inductive in the Does that make sense?
Sort of.
Like, do you feel like you were working from like general categories that you were aiming for initially and working down through those, or do you feel like more of those categories emerged
Yeah.
actually from the data and
Yeah.
the bottom-up process?
Here, the hope would be they emerged.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we wouldn't have done what we were attempting to with trustworthiness. So our goal with the word by word, the line by line, and then the looking at the categories and then categorizing the categories would be that they emerged. And then the wording specifically that would be used within the grounded theory literature would be emerged. That's what I think happened. Now, when it comes to self-awareness, what's the one with the windows? You should know this, right? We've talked about this, and not to call you out, sorry, but we've talked about this at some point. I know what I know, I don't know what I don't know, I know what I don't know, and all those. So it could be that we didn't know what we didn't know, and that we potentially influenced it. I think with our discussions amongst the group of the six of us and our discussions with our advisor, I think we did a nice job, I hope, of ensuring that the trustworthiness was there and they emerged from the participants. That's where it got tricky with certain parts where at one point I said, okay, this really fits with what I went through as a master's male counselor in training. Is this coming? And so I said to the other five, I want to put that out there because I want to make sure that I am not saying like, here's what it is, when really I'm just describing myself. And so we discussed that for a bit, and ultimately it was they all said, I don't think you're doing that. So I said, okay, good. Because it was just eerie how close it was. Which I think actually also fit with the literature when in our discussion section I didn't get into that level of depth, but in our discussion of our manuscript that's almost done, as the literature that already did exist from looking anything especially within the counseling profession, there's some studies that have looked at men around different topics, but even in those different topics, some similarities, which was really interesting and exciting, because part of the process within the qualitative research is the literature review looks a little different than it would be with quantitative. So it can be tricky to do enough to inform the study without doing so much that then it becomes the other thing, where we're deciding beforehand what the categories should be, whether or not it's in our awareness, and so there's a balance there that I still don't quite know where that balance is. Whatever it ended up being, the balance, there definitely was that after the fact, we looked at those studies. We hadn't actually found them prior, and we looked at them and went, ooh, wow. And for me, it was a very exciting time because we had done something separate from these studies that had overlap, which was cool. So I think that's a really important one that within constructivist philosophy, within this grounded theory, is really important to know inductive, deductive, and to know where these categories are coming from, and to try to put in steps to ensure that they're coming from the participants. Yeah. Thanks. Any others?
I just have a general question about what kind of the motivation or motivate you investigate these research questions. What's the importance, and if the result comes up, how you implement that result in your clinic, counseling, education.
Yeah, I think for me the motivation was that minority in numbers category and the external facilitators. My awareness of my masculinity shifted in a lot of significant ways as a counselor in training, a master's program, that then when I was in doctoral program increased. I became aware of it even more because I was the only male in my cohort. I was the only male on my campus. There was only one other male for the first year, and then 3. So at most 3 men out of, I think, 18 doc students. So a large number of women compared to men. It was all either men or women in terms of self-identification. So I came out of a master's program with that awareness, kind of there. It was in there, but I hadn't quite made sense of it. Then I get into the doc program, I'm one of the only men, again, even more drastically. And then similarly in the master's program that was a part of the doc program. The way within counselor education is when there's a doc program, there's also a master's program. So we interact with and do a lot of our hands-on teaching experiences with the master's students. Same sort of thing, similar sort of proportions. So all of a sudden it was just obvious to me. Like, oh, wait a minute, this is influence to me. And that's where that curiosity came from. And that's what continues to motivate it. Similarly so my dissertation is a grounded theory looking at white counselors in training. So a similar sort of thing where I realized, well, the counseling profession is very white. So now that overlap that's where I kind of joke, like the overlap is me, is because I'm looking at white dudes most of the time if you put them together. But kind of as my awareness increased, my curiosity started to emerge that then informed this. Now what I found out when I said it to the rest of the research team is that I'm having this curiosity. They were too, in their own ways, because their awareness of gender was also present as they were going through their own similar sorts of processes connected to the doc program. So it all fit really well.
I'm curious because I definitely have some parallels in early childhood education.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, people identify as male and they're not yet being female. So I'm curious about thinking about the process of how they encounter the counseling education or in female-dominated professions.
Yeah.
And it would be interesting.
Yeah.
Have you thought about that?
Not very much.
Yeah.
But I think there's something there. Yes.
Yeah. And what kind of professions those are in regards to like being helping professions
Right.
versus, and what that means around the idea of social norms around masculinity and how that is projected.
It may be possible to write that up without having to do. There may be enough research that exists from each of the professions. So we reference. I know often a profession that we'll reference is nursing, and I think they have a little more in those areas. And then you're fine. And then of course we have this, which hopefully you could reference this sometime soon. Within counselor journals, it would be like a year from now probably, when it would be accepted.
Do you find in counseling and counseling education that there's a push that they would like to have more male representation?
Yeah.
Because that's something for us that is a big deal. Like, what's it
Yeah.
like how do we have more males in early childhood education? And
Yeah.
I wonder if that's also, like in nursing, is that something as well? I haven't really thought about it. Like,
I would guess so. And that's where that Yeah, exactly.
looking to target or?
And then that's where that interesting phenomenon of the noticing of their maleness, really it being other people's assumption that they identify as a male, because I don't know that they really talked about being asked, but that maleness being so kind of prized in some ways, but also like this interesting mix again of where they weren't feeling oppressed, but or at least they weren't saying they were feeling oppressed, but then there was this tokenization, but a privileging, but also a marginalization, this all at the same time. Yeah. And I think part of it being like, ooh, a man has come. And then like, let's make sure they come in and they do. So that can be tricky, right? Because we also still need to be challenging and still need to be facilitating. And yeah. That was some of our implications ended up being, right? Again, it didn't, because of the time didn't go into that level of detail for this, but the implications being that is, our plan to publish this is to publish this in counselor education and supervision. That's where we plan to submit first. And that is a journal that's about doing the faculty side of these programs. And it fits really well with this. And our implications as they are currently really focusing in on increasing awareness of the masculinity being present. And so by increasing the awareness, maybe we reduce the number of like that tokenizing and privileging while increasing the awareness of the existence of it. So then hopefully this sort of process can be occurring more intentionally. And so there's an increased awareness of the manness of it all. Yeah. Which also fits with counseling. I mean, that's kind of what we're doing most of the time, is just increase awareness. We have like 5 more minutes left. If anybody has any other.
I just have a comment, not a question, but it's really interesting hearing you talk about this because I am a female in construction management.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So I see this all in reverse.
Yes.
And so when you had the quote up there of like saying like this student, I was like, because I do the same thing to my female students. I'm like, I know who you are, because it's like, you're the only one, like,
Right.
you got your name.
Yeah.
So that quote was like, oh geez.
Yeah.
Doing that. So it's just interesting because a lot of this, I never thought, I mean, I guess for myself, I thought about my femininity being in a construction
Yeah, yeah,
management,
definitely.
But I never thought about like my students, how they feel
Mhm.
because I know for
Yeah.
me, like, yeah, so it's just, I don't know, it's just cool seeing what you saw, because I wonder if the same would be true in reverse.
Yeah, and my guess would be that the societal influences would look differently.
Mm-hmm.
Is my guess.
Yeah.
Because I didn't hear, none of the men were expressing instances of, none of the men were expressing instances of what we would call sexism.
Okay.
Although some of the men were discussing instances of being hit on. Maybe one of the only men, and also going through this process where they're kind of countering masculinity, which some of their counterparts who were attracted to them found them more attractive because they're now expressing themselves and there's vulnerability. It's just these things that kind of counter some and fit with that shared value that goes within the counseling profession.
Yeah.
So almost having that, like, none of them talked about it like a "ooh, look at me" sort of scenario, but they did kind of talk about like it is odd, and some of them were okay with it, and some of them didn't care. There wasn't any sort of like this is horrible.
Right.
Whereas I would wonder how that might differ. It sounds like you have a study to do.
Let me finish my dissertation.
Yeah, that's true. Yes, finish your dissertation. So I think that kind of wraps up our time. Thanks for coming. Thanks for the conversation. I hope something was gleaned from all of it. And I'll be here to chat if anybody has other questions. Oh yeah, and then my contact info is here. If anybody wants to email or call or stop by or something, feel free.